high windows of the modern State House, Julian looked out over a capital that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his own heartbeat. Having climbed the rungs of global finance before entering the political arena, he felt a sense of absolute autonomy. To him, the office of the Prime Minister was a high-performance engine, and he was its master technician. He believed that his logic, honed in boardrooms and balance sheets, was the ultimate tool to reshape the nation. From this height, the citizens were data points in a grand equation, and the power he held felt as solid as the reinforced glass before him. Julian's signature policy was the Nexus Mandate, a decree making advanced mathematics and laboratory sciences compulsory for every student until 18. He sat across from Rowan, a defiant student leader, and laid out a series of impeccable charts. He spoke of GDP growth, technological parity, and the objective beauty of a STEM-led economy. Julian assumed that reason was a universal currency. He expected Rowan to see the logic of the numbers, that students were the essential fuel for national progress, and yield to the obvious necessity of the plan. Rowan did not look at the charts. Instead, he looked Julian in the eye with a cold, calculated smirk. "This isn't about progress, Julian," Rowan said, his voice carrying a sharp edge. "This is absolute hardship. You are treating us like mere tools for your economic machine, stripping away our autonomy for the sake of productivity." Then, lowering his voice to a hiss, he added a strategic poison. "But then, why would an outsider like you care about our traditions of philosophy and art? You're trying to force a cold, foreign calculation onto a culture you don't truly belong to." Julian was stunned. His logical arguments were being bypassed by a weaponized identity he hadn't prepared for. Retreating to his office, Julian opened a secured digital folder entitled The Keys. He realized that logic was only one tool, and a fragile one at that. He looked at a map of dependencies, understanding that his seat was held aloft by pillars of influence rather than the weight of his arguments. To govern was not to lead through reason, but to manage the interests of those who held the structural supports. As long as the keys turned in his favor, the door to power remained open, regardless of the rising noise from Rowan's calculated cultural divide. The most vital key was the capital. Julian met with Sterling, an industrial magnate and the party's primary donor, at a discreet high-tech club. Sterling's billions funded the digital machinery that kept Julian's image polished. Sterling approved of the Nexus Mandate because he wanted a specialized, high-output workforce. Julian realized that the promise of a donation was more influential than 1,000,000 signatures. He assured Sterling that the reforms would proceed, believing that the donor's money could drown out Rowan's populist rhetoric. The second key was the caucus. Julian met with Nadia, the veteran party whip, in the sterile corridors of the legislature. Nadia controlled the loyalty of the backbenchers. She was visibly nervous, holding a tablet filled with vitriolic social media feeds. Rowan's rhetoric had taken root. He was successfully mobilizing a base by painting Julian as a man whose background made him fundamentally other. Julian insisted the logic of the policy would eventually win. Nadia's expression remained skeptical. She knew that for her members, political survival mattered more than the Prime Minister's logic. Outside the State House, the public key was turning into a weapon. Rowan stood on a makeshift stage, his voice amplified across the city square. He didn't focus on the curriculum's difficulty. Instead, he leaned into the resentment he had cultivated. He framed the mandate as an assault on student freedom by a leader whose values were alien to the spirit of the nation. Beside him, an angry supporter held a sign echoing Rowan's rhetoric. The crowd roared their approval. Julian watched from his monitor, realizing that against the heat of manufactured identity, his cold logic was melting. As the unrest grew, Julian sought out Sterling once more, expecting the donor to help stabilize the narrative. Instead, he found Sterling cold and distant. The billionaire was watching the news of the boycotts and the rising instability. "I invest in stability, Julian, not in culture wars," Sterling said flatly. "If the people see you as a liability to the national brand because of your background, you are no longer useful to me." Julian realized the capital key was never loyal to him. It was loyal to the quietude required for the market to thrive. The end came in a secluded garden, far from the protesters. Nadia met Sterling in the shadows of a stone archway. They were no longer discussing how to save the Nexus mandate, they were discussing Julian's successor. They saw that Julian had become a lightning rod for a fire they couldn't control. To protect the architecture of their own influence, the keys began to align against the man they had built up. The logic of power had shifted. Julian was now the variable that needed to be removed to restore the peace. Julian walked out of the State House for the last time, carrying nothing but a single briefcase. On the street, he saw Rowan and his followers celebrating a victory for autonomy over state utility. Julian looked up at the glass and steel towers and finally understood the architecture of consent. No leader stands on a pedestal of their own merit. They are held up by the hands of the keys. Once the populist tide made those hands tremble, the leader, regardless of his logic or his lineage, was just another man on the sidewalk.